Okay, so let's continue our discussion of elimination reactions of alkyl halides by now transitioning to E2 reactions. E2 is bimolecular elimination. And just like the others, I'll start with the mechanism. In E2, similar to E1, you of course have a leaving group. On a carbon we'll denote as the alpha carbon. A beta proton must be removed. And I'll add some other fictitious substituents so we can think about stereochemistry. So, in the E2 reaction, we'll have a reagent that serves as a base. We'll find out soon it's a very strong base. We talked about how elimination becomes faster and more favorable at higher temperatures relative to substitution. And in this mechanism, the base retrieves an alpha or a beta proton. And that beta proton is going to donate towards the alpha carbon its electron density to expel the leaving group in a concerted step.